Hi everyone, and welcome back to College Finds YouTube channel. Before we get started, as always, remember to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our college application or test prep videos. And if you find this video on getting into Harvard helpful, click the like button below and share it with your friends so they can also receive this helpful advice. Let's get started. Today we're going to talk about one of the most selective and revered colleges in the country, which is Harvard. Harvard is my alma mater, so it's a topic that's close to my heart. Part of the storied Ivy League, Harvard boasts high-quality academics in a really beautiful setting in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the acceptance rate has recently crept below 5%. Luckily, at College Find, we are experts on getting into Harvard. Many of us have done it ourselves, and we've gotten dozens of other students in as well. We know what works in terms of getting into Harvard, and so in this video, we're going to give you a sneak peek of our top tips for gaining admission to this most selective school. If Harvard is on your college list, you won't want to miss this helpful advice. Let's talk a little bit about Harvard before we go into admissions. So Harvard was founded in 1636, and it's actually the oldest institution of higher education in the United States. Harvard University is located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's just outside of Boston. As you probably know, it's one of the 8 schools that make up the prestigious Ivy League set of institutions, and traditionally the Harvard rival is Yale within the Ivy League. Currently, the U.S. News and World Report rankings place Harvard as the number 2 ranked college in the National Universities category. Harvard University holds a special place in the academic and popular culture of the United States. The university's near instant name recognition and reputation give it a unique power even among other elite colleges and Ivy League schools. Not surprisingly, Harvard's prestige is reflected in its competitive undergraduate application process. It only gets more and more competitive every year. So, as it gets more competitive every year, how hard is it to actually get into Harvard? Well, it's extremely selective. It's one of the hardest schools to get into in the country. For the undergraduate class of 2023, Harvard received more than 43,000 applicants and accepted just over 2,000 of them, for an overall acceptance rate of approximately 4.7%. Of the accepted students, more than 1,600 decided to attend, which gives the school an 82% yield rate, which is quite high. Harvard was the second most selective college in the country with its class of 2023. The only one that was more selective was Stanford. And so building a strong transcript and extracurricular resume is really no longer enough to receive a coveted Harvard acceptance letter. What can you do to stand out in this competitive process? Let's walk through each component of the application. First, the actual application itself. So Harvard accepts the Common App, the Coalition application, and the Universal application form. All of those are considered equally, so you should feel free to choose the system that feels best for you. Whichever form you use, you'll need to fill out all of Harvard's required supplemental essay questions. And that supplement includes an essay that's technically optional, but we strongly encourage you to submit it. In the comments below this video, we're going to link our popular blog post about tackling that special Harvard essay. It's called How to Write the Harvard University Supplemental Essay for 2019 and 2020. You also have a choice not only of which application system to use, but of when to submit your application. So alongside its regular decision application deadline, which is January 1st, Harvard has a restrictive early action program, which carries a November 1st deadline. For more information on applying early and what restrictive early action really means for your application process, you can take a look at our blog post, Early Decision versus Early Action versus Restrictive Early Action. That, as always, is linked in the comments below this video. Whichever options you choose for system and date, you'll still need to fill out all of the standard application questions that colleges ask. For that information, you might want to check out our post, The User's Guide to the Common Application, also linked in the comments. You'll need to include the following materials alongside your completed application via one of those 3 systems. Those things are an application fee of $75 or a fee waiver request that's completed, a school report completed by your counselor or another school official, a counselor recommendation that's obviously completed by your counselor, a mid-year report that comes a bit later from your typical deadline, but that's also completed by your counselor, a final report completed by your counselor, 2 letters of recommendation from chosen teachers, official score reports for the SAT and ACT that you request and are sent directly to Harvard College. Harvard also strongly suggests that you submit scores from 2 SAT 2 subject tests. So those are the required components of your application. Let's talk about interviews, which is a topic that many students ask us about. Most Harvard applicants interview for Harvard through the alumni interview system. So when you've submitted your application to Harvard, whether through early action or through regular decision, you will generally get reached out to by an alumni interviewer to participate in an interview with that person. If you live in the United States, the interviewer will contact you about arranging an in-person interview. They'll use the contact information you provided in your application. You will set an agreeable time, an agreeable place. That place is usually a coffee shop or some other public place, sometimes your high school. And it'll be a conversation that's meant to reveal more about who you are and get a chance to really meet you outside of just your application on paper. If you live outside the United States, your interview options are dependent on the number of Harvard alumni available to conduct interviews in your area. If you live in the United Kingdom or in Canada, an interviewer will contact you to make arrangements just as in the United States. But if you live in another country, you may need to email Harvard and initiate contact with an interviewer yourself, or you may only be contacted for an interview if the admissions office specifically requests more information about you. It all kind of depends on your individual country, but more information about these interview differences is available on the admissions section of the Harvard website. In some areas of the world, just remember that interviews are simply not possible for applicants due to a lack of interviewers. And if you're not able to participate in an interview due to geography or other factors, don't worry, you are not going to be penalized when your application is reviewed. That being said, you should still make every effort to arrange an interview if possible. Once again, for all of this information on interviews, you should visit the admissions website or contact the admissions office at Harvard for additional information on your particular situation. Those are some of the various components of your application. Let's deep dive into the ones that are most important as the admissions committee begins to evaluate your application. Harvard proudly practices holistic admissions, and in fact, Harvard is one of the institutions that has most led the call for a more holistic college admissions approach. That means that Harvard will evaluate your overall profile as a candidate and really as a human being. The admissions committee looks at many factors, including grades, academics, activities, extracurriculars, essays, letters of recommendation, and the interview. In addition, Harvard looks for evidence of exceptional talents and character, of course. Often, academics play the largest role in decision making. So your grades, your SAT scores are one of the first things that the admissions committee looks at. But that does not mean that activities and essays are not important. They trail behind only slightly in the holistic admissions calculation. Let's look at each category in more detail, starting with academics and standardized tests. When it comes to your transcript, Harvard is looking at two things: how rigorous was your schedule and how strong were your grades. That whole decision-making process makes up about 30% of your admissions evaluation. That's pretty standard for all selective schools, not just Harvard. Students often wonder if their particular profile, my set of grades and my scores, is enough to get them into a school like Harvard. Well, it's hard to actually answer that question directly because it all depends on context. So for example, if your school offers 16 AP classes and you've only taken 5, that's less impressive than a student who went to a school that offered 4 APs, but they took 3 of them and an additional test through self-study. That context is really important in evaluating your profile. The same principle applies to your grades. So getting an A- in an AP class is more impressive than getting an A in a standard level course. That means that you shouldn't be afraid to challenge yourself academically, even if you get slightly lower grades because of that challenge. Harvard also strongly considers your standardized test scores on the SAT or the ACT. Of course, if you have higher scores, you will have a higher chance of acceptance. You can see if you're on track to meet Harvard's academic expectations by researching how your particular profile, your grades, and your test scores stack up against the average applicant who was accepted in the most recent cycle. However, we'll give you a little peek. For GPA, 93% of admitted students submit a GPA of 3.75 or above, and the average high school GPA of admitted freshmen was 4.18. For SAT, the middle 50% range of verbal scores was 720 to 780 out of 800, and the middle 50% range for math scores was 740 to 800 out of 800. On the ACT, the middle 50% range was 33 to 35 out of 36 for the admitted freshman class last year. Some other important things to keep in mind about Harvard's academic requirements are that the writing sections of the SAT and the ACT are not required, but they are considered if you submit them. Also, Harvard does not practice superscoring, but they do look at all section scores from all test scores submitted, so you should submit all of your scores. Next, let's take a look at extracurricular activities. Evaluation of your activities makes up about a quarter of your overall admissions decision. That's particularly true at highly competitive schools such as Harvard, where academics, frankly, are a bit uniform across the applying class, and they need activities to distinguish each individual applicant from the pack. So your activities are one of the best ways to provide that unique distinguishment that other applicants don't have. At CollegeVine, we use a tiering system to rank your activities and let you know how impressive they are, because when we say tier, we really mean a scale of impressiveness. And by impressiveness, we really mean dedication, leadership, and recognition in those activities. Our tier system ranges from Tier 1 to Tier 4, and Tier 1 is the highest or most impressive activity. Students accepted to top colleges like Harvard typically have 1 or maybe even 2 Tier 1 activities. They have 2 or 3 Tier 2 activities, And then they have a handful of Tier 3 and 4 activities to round out their section. Tier 4 activities are the ones that are pretty general, limited involvement in a club or an organization. This might be IM sports, maybe you're in your school's band or orchestra. Most, if not all, students in a graduating class will hold these more common Tier 4s. Tier 3s, one step up the ladder, are those that indicate dedicated membership of an organization and maybe some small distinction as well. So maybe you were on the Model UN team, you received some award in your robotics team, or you played on varsity tennis. All those are Tier 3s. Many, but not all students in your class will hold some Tier 3s. Tier 2 activities are more impressive. They have an involved leadership position or a demonstrable achievement or distinction. For example, you were the captain of your track team or the state champion in robotics. Only a select few students in a graduating class will hold Tier 2 activities, so they are pretty impressive. Tier 1 activities, though, are the ones that are the most impressive. They are rare, they have superior leadership or achievement, and most likely they will make you particularly distinctive in the applicant pool because you'll probably be the only one that has that particular activity. One example might be creating an entire nonprofit organization and managing it yourself. That takes a lot of leadership, and it's an achievement to create something entirely new when you are only a teenager. You should use the activity section to highlight all of your extracurriculars and accomplishments, all of those that you want to make admissions officers realize that you're different, you're unique, and there's more to you than just your high grades and SATs. The next factor in the admissions decision is your essays. Those essays make up between 25 to 30% of that holistic admissions decision. And it's because they are one of the only places where the officer can really understand who you are as a person beyond all these paper stats that they see, like your SAT scores or the awards you won for robotics. As you begin to think about the richness of those essays, remember that they always ought to have a cohesive theme, they ought to be deeply introspective and personal, and they need to engage and compel the admissions committee. Unfortunately, those requirements are a bit tough for a lot of students, and we see a lot of applicants who have the grades and the test scores to get in, but are not used to producing the kind of creative writing that makes for a strong college essay. Really, to make your essay as engaging as possible, the main piece of advice is to focus on showing, not telling. It's especially important for creative writing like a college essay. I'll illustrate this through an example. So here's an example of telling. I have always loved art history. On the weekends, I like to go to museums and visit old paintings and sculptures. I'm fascinated by how much the art that someone creates can tell you about their life. When I look at Van Gogh's painting, I imagine him sitting down and actually creating it. The writing in that example was very straightforward, and ultimately we didn't get a glimpse of what the writer feels, how they feel about art, about Van Gogh, really about anything. This example shows better than tells. For a second, I saw Van Gogh dipping his paintbrush into the pigments on his palette, each bristle becoming draped in a swirl of bright blue. His hand moved carefully and quickly as he covered the canvas with dots and dashes. Whack! The red-headed artist vanished. One of the many other museum visitors bumped into me, and I came crashing back into 2019. So, that essay example really brings us to the specific moment the author is experiencing when they're standing in front of that Van Gogh painting in the museum, and it helps us to understand how mesmerized they are by Van Gogh. It tells us that this author really loves art and loses themselves in the art, actually. So that's more engaging, and it's a more intimate look at the author's life. The essay overall is one of the most nuanced components of the application process, and this video, unfortunately, is not all about essays. For more essay advice, you can check out many of our other videos or some of our top blog posts, which are linked below in the comments. Yet another way that the admissions committee gains insight into who you are as a person and as a student is through your letters of recommendation. Great college recommendation letters give the admissions committee additional context about your high school achievements, but more than that, they offer a sense of who you are as a person and the process of actually achieving all of the impressive things that you did on your resume. Harvard requires 2 teacher recommendations and 1 counselor recommendation. For all 3 of those letters, it's best to request them during the spring semester of your junior year of high school. It may seem early because next year's applications are not actually released, but this early timeline gets your recommender thinking about what they have to say and gives them the entire rest of the spring, the entire summer, and early fall to put together an excellent recommendation letter. The majority of your classmates won't request their letters until a month or 2 before their deadline, and so if you give your recommender more time in advance, they'll probably write you a better letter. At the very least, though, you need to always remember to ask at least 1 month before your deadline to be courteous of their time. Many students have trouble deciding which teachers to ask, so here's the core pieces of advice. You want teachers who know you well, who you've had recently in class, And ideally, those who know you outside of class too. Maybe they are your soccer coach or they advise the robotics club. You might try to ask teachers in different disciplines, like a chemistry teacher and a social studies teacher. That's a lot of boxes to check. It's not always possible to do it all. So remember that the main goal is that you just want teachers who know you well and will speak positively of you both in the classroom and as a human being. Another thing you might want to consider is whether you aced the teacher's class or not. Usually you want to ask teachers who you got an A in their class, but you might also want to ask teachers for whom their class was a challenge, as long as you did demonstrate perseverance and ultimately overcame that challenge to achieve some success. Keep in mind that teachers may ask you to provide them with a brag sheet, which is basically a resume of your activities and your honors. Your counselor, who also needs to write a letter, might also want that brag sheet, so it's a good thing to have ready when you request your recommendations. Finally, if you're really truly set on attending Harvard, you really need to know that your chances are better if you apply under the restrictive early action program. While it's true that early action applicants do tend to be a more qualified pool overall than applicants in regular decision, our data, many thousands of data points, indicates that even when you control for GPA and test scores, early action applicants are still accepted at a higher rate than regular decision applicants. For instance, last year, Harvard accepted 13.4% of students who applied to the early action program. That's more than double and nearly 3 times the overall acceptance rate of 4.7%. Much lower in that regular decision round. Core piece of advice here. If you want to attend Harvard, you want to apply early to maximize your shot. That is all in terms of our tips of getting into Harvard. For more information about highly selective schools, including Harvard, but also including other Ivy Leagues, other NESCAC schools, other leading public institutions, you can check out the CollegeVine blog. You can also visit us online at app.collegevine.com for more overall guidance. That's it for today. Thank you as always for visiting our YouTube channel. And if you're applying to college this season, best of luck.